Soviet troops move into the bunker, and they confirm not just the fall of the Third Reich, but the death of Adolf Hitler himself.
For 70 years, he kept his mouth shut, not because he was guilty, but because speaking meant death. Now, at the very end of his life, Hitler's own cousin, Johann Schmidt Jr., finally breaks his silence. This is the truth he was never allowed to tell about the man behind the dictator, the family that lived in fear of him, and the price an innocent relative paid for a name he never chose. The fall of the Third Reich and the beginning of a hidden story. When Soviet troops entered the ruins of Berlin in the spring of 1945, they stepped into a city that was barely breathing. Smoke drifted through shattered streets, buildings stood open like broken ribs, and deep beneath the ground, inside a bunker carved into the earth, they found confirmation of what the world had waited years to hear. The Third Reich had fallen, and Adolf Hitler was dead. It should have marked the final page of a nightmare that had scorched continents and taken millions of lives. For most of Europe, that moment felt like a long-delayed breath. Church bells rang freely for the first time in years. Prison gates opened. Crowds filled the streets, laughing and crying in equal measure, their faces lifted to a sky no longer lit by falling fire. But history is rarely neat, and endings are never the same for everyone. Because while Europe celebrated liberation, another story, a quieter, darker one, was being written far from the world's attention. A story not about armies or dictators, but about a single, ordinary man whose life would be destroyed not by any crime he committed, but by the blood in his veins. His name was Johann Schmidt Jr. To historians, he barely existed. No photographs in textbooks, no interviews, no surviving diaries. Just a whisper in the archives, a rumor passed between researchers, a footnote in the shadow of a monstrous relative. He never commanded soldiers, never joined the Nazi Party, never held authority of any kind. And yet the moment Hitler's bunker was discovered, Johann's fate was sealed because he was Adolf Hitler's cousin, a connection that would become more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. The moment the Soviet soldiers confirmed Hitler's death, they also began hunting for anyone connected to him, anyone who shared the name, the lineage, or even the suspicion of a blood tie. And Johann became a target without ever stepping into the war that defined his lifetime. What Johann did not know, and what no one in the world yet knew, was that the truth he carried would one day return, demanding to be spoken before it was too late. A ghost in the bloodline, Johann's inheritance. Long before the world knew his name, and long before he learned to fear it, Johann Schmidt Jr. lived an ordinary life in the gentle countryside of northern Austria. He was born into the quiet rhythm of the Waldviertel, a region of rolling fields, dense forests, and small farms passed down through generations. For the families who lived there, life was shaped by seasons, not politics. Johann grew up expecting the same future as everyone around him: steady work, a family of his own, and the comfort of familiar soil beneath his feet. He tended fields with his father, learned the habits of the land, and lived in a world where the biggest worries were harvests, weather, and the slow pace of rural change. But hidden beneath that simple life was a truth his family rarely spoke aloud: that he was related to Adolf Hitler. His father and Hitler were cousins, their mother's sisters. As a child, Johann thought little of it. To him, the uncle, as the family sometimes called Hitler in private, was merely a distant relative, someone who appeared occasionally in stories whispered between adults. He was not a presence in Johann's daily life. He did not influence his upbringing, his education, or his ambitions. But as Johann grew older, the world around him began to shift. News traveled slowly to the countryside, carried by newspapers, radio static, and conversations overheard at market stalls. Before Johann understood what was happening, the cousin who had once seemed unremarkable had risen into a national figure and then into something far more dangerous. By the early 1930s, the name Hitler carried a weight Johann could feel even in the most remote corners of Austria. People lowered their voices when they said it. Some said it with hope, others said it with fear, but everyone said it carefully. And for Johann, hearing that name was like listening to a distant storm building strength over the horizon. A storm tied to a man who shared his blood. He did not see power. He did not see ideology. He saw danger. Each time Hitler appeared in a newspaper headline, Johann felt the invisible thread tugging at his life. Each time he heard the speeches crackling through the radio, he realized the name he shared was no longer ordinary. It has become a symbol, and symbols are dangerous things. He began to feel it in the stares of strangers who happened to glance at his paperwork, in questions asked too casually by people he did not trust, in the tightening silence inside his home whenever politics appeared on the evening broadcast. Johann learned to live with caution, with restraint, with the quiet fear that one day the world might knock on his door and demand answers to questions he never asked and never had. He did not choose his bloodline, but he understood its risks. And as Hitler's power grew from political agitator to chancellor and then to Führer, Johann's dread grew with it. He saw what happened to people who opposed the regime. He heard stories of neighbors taken away in the night, and he understood a cruel truth. Silence was his only protection. For more than a decade, Johann lived in the shadow of a rising dictator, hoping that obscurity would shield him. But history is relentless, and bloodlines are not so easily ignored. And when the war finally ended, the world turned its attention to the question he feared most. Who were Hitler's relatives? Johann's silence had protected him through the rise of the Reich, but now, as the guns quieted and the Soviet army marched across Austria, that same silence was about to become the very reason he was hunted. Johann learned to stay silent, but even then, a single thought haunted him. One day someone will ask, and when they do, what do I tell them? But before he ever opened up, he paid the costly price of having Hitler's blood run through him. The roots of the Hitler family and Johann's lineage. Long before the world tied the name Hitler, it belonged to families who lived quiet, unremarkable lives in the Waldviertel, a wooded region of northern Austria where the hills rolled gently and the pastures stretched toward the Danube. The land is old, settled by generations who relied on the soil more than on politics, and it was there in the stillness of farm life that the tangled roots of the Hitler family first took hold. At the center of that history stood a mystery that historians still debate. Who was Adolf Hitler's paternal grandfather? Hitler's grandmother, Maria Schicklgruber, gave birth to Alois, Hitler's father, in the year 1837. But she never mentioned who the father was. The official records were blank, and the truth, whether a shameful secret, a personal choice, or something else, entirely disappeared with her. Some believed the father was Johann Georg Hiedler, the man Maria later married. Others suspected it might have been his brother. A few even suggested a local Jewish man. No theory has ever been proven. That uncertainty would haunt Adolf Hitler throughout his life, but it also shaped his extended family, including Johann Schmidt Jr., whose fate would be tied to these same unresolved origins. Maria's son, Alois, eventually changed his surname from Schicklgruber to Hitler, a decision that simplified lineage but concealed deeper fractures. Alois grew into a stern, domineering figure, and his children, including Adolf, inherited a family story full of silences and contradictions. But Alois was not an only child. His sisters carried the family line into other villages, other homes, other lives. One of them, Johanna Hiedler, became a key link in Johann Schmidt Jr.'s ancestry. Johanna had a daughter named Maria Schmidt, Hitler's cousin. Unlike Adolf, Maria never left the countryside for Vienna. She never dreamed of art school or political power. She married a local man, Karl Koppensteiner, raised children, and lived the kind of quiet life that defined the Waldviertel for centuries. It was into this world that Johann Schmidt Jr. was born. His parents, Johann Sr. and Maria Schmidt, worked modestly and lived simply. They did not chase ambition. They did not seek public life, and they certainly never imagined that their relative Adolf would one day reshape the world and the meaning of their surname. And as Adolf Hitler left home for Linz and then Vienna, pursuing dreams that darkened into something far more sinister, Johann remained rooted in the soil of his ancestors. One cousin chased power, the other tended the land. The last time Johann saw Adolf Hitler was in the year 1907. Hitler was a teenager, quiet and watchful, already carrying a detachment that others found unsettling. He visited the family briefly, said little, and left little impression beyond his odd intensity. No one then could have imagined the impact that visit would eventually have. For Johann, Hitler was not a future dictator or a political leader. He was simply a relative, distant, strange, and unremarkable. But as Hitler's rise accelerated in the 1920s and 1930s, that small, distant connection transformed into something dangerous. The same family tree that once linked a few quiet villages now stretched into the very heart of a growing political storm. The farther Hitler climbed, the heavier the burden became for the relatives he left behind. By the time Hitler reached absolute power, the Schmidt and Koppensteiner families no longer spoke his name loudly. They avoided it, sidestepped it, and hid it. Still, none of them could truly ever escape it. He grew up knowing the bloodline he carried was dangerous, yet he never imagined the moment would come when he'd be forced to reveal what he had seen with his own eyes. The burden of sharing Hitler's blood. For Johann Schmidt Jr. and his relatives, the rise of Adolf Hitler created a danger no one could have predicted. Every year the shadow grew longer. Every year hiding became harder. Two branches of the family chose two very different paths. Adolf's half-nephew, William Patrick Hitler, was the one relative who tried to use the family name for advantage. He traveled from Liverpool to Germany, hoping his uncle would offer him a position, influence, maybe a future. Instead, Adolf saw him as an embarrassment.
I have just left Germany, and Adolf Hitler, who is my uncle, I personally have no time for.
A foreign relative who did not fit the image of the new Germany. William quickly understood his mistake. He fled west, denounced Hitler in newspapers, and wrote essays with titles such as "Why I Hate My Uncle." His rebellion was loud, dramatic, and done from a safe distance. He made sure the world knew he wanted nothing to do with the man destroying Europe. While William made noise, Johann's family made themselves invisible. His relatives in the Waldviertel lived in constant fear. William's outbursts, instead of protecting them, reminded the world and the Nazi Party that the Führer had living cousins. Every document that required family information brought panic. Every stranger at the door felt like a threat. Every careless word could be fatal. They lived with the fear that anyone, a neighbor seeking revenge, a local official looking for promotion, could expose them. They could not claim pride in the family connection, but they could not deny it either. They were trapped between danger and suspicion. As Adolf Hitler tightened his grip on Germany, paranoia grew. Loyalty became an obsession, and anyone remotely connected to him was watched.
Being more Nazi than their neighbor allowed Germans to advance socially and professionally, since the Nazi Party controlled everything.
The Schmidts, once ordinary rural people, now lived under a silent, invisible pressure. They had no protection, no influence, no escape, just a name they could not outrun. While William used his voice in the West, Johann's family used silence in Austria. But silence can only protect you for so long. When the war finally ended, that silence shattered. The family hid in silence, terrified of being found. But Johann always felt that one day the past would corner him, and he would have no choice but to tell the truth he'd kept buried. 1945. Liberation for Europe. Doom for Johann. In the spring of 1945, a strange quiet settled across Europe. It was not the quiet of peace, it was the quiet that follows a scream. The war was finally ending. Nazi Germany had collapsed, and the world exhaled for the first time in 6 relentless years. In the cities, people cried in the streets.
It wouldn't have been possible without a great deal of help from the local population.
Flags came down from buildings where they had flown like threats. Prison gates opened, spilling out men and women who had nearly forgotten sunlight. Church bells rang bold, unafraid, echoing through air that no longer smelled of smoke. For most of Europe, liberation had arrived, but not everywhere. Across the border in Austria, especially in the zones now controlled by Soviet forces, freedom did not arrive with open arms. It arrived like another storm rolling in before the sky had even cleared from the last one. The soldiers moving into the Waldviertel were not gentle liberators. They were men who had crawled through the furnace of the Eastern Front. Many had buried brothers in the snow, watched their homes burn, or held their dying friends on frozen ground. They carried those memories with them, memories that made justice feel like something sharp, something personal. And when the fighting ended, their mission shifted. They were no longer battling armies, they were hunting shadows. Their orders were simple, erasing every remaining trace of Nazism. When the NKVD arrived, they carried long lists filled not with crimes, but with names. Who a person's cousin was, who their uncle had been, what blood ran beneath their skin. And in those lists, one connection stood out like a stain that could not be washed away, a blood tie to Adolf Hitler. For the Schmidt and Koppensteiner families, the war's end should have meant safety. For 12 years they had lived like shadows, speaking carefully, avoiding attention, praying no one would ever notice the truth tucked into their family tree. But the world had a long memory. One evening, as daylight faded behind the hills, the stillness of their farmyard cracked beneath the sound of boots, heavy, deliberate military boots. Johann Schmidt Jr. knew instantly that something was wrong. So did his parents. The soldiers entered without shouting, as if the decision had been made long before they arrived. They did not ask questions. They did not accuse. They simply read the names from the list they carried.
They discover that they can enlist and recruit and use local populations.
They informed the family they were being taken into custody. No explanation was offered. No personal belongings were allowed. No moments were given to say goodbye. In less time than it takes a kettle to boil, the life the Schmidts had built over generations was erased. The house remained standing, but everything inside it, the laughter, the memories, the years, was now unreachable. They were not leaving as citizens, not as farmers, not even as individuals. They were leaving as enemies of the state, and their only crime was the blood they carried. And so, Johann's fate, once tied only to the quiet soil of his Austrian village, began drifting toward a place so far, so cold, and so merciless that Europe itself seemed to fall away behind him, a place where only survival mattered, a place from which many would never return. As the soldiers marched him away, Johann realized the war might have ended for the world, but for him, the real story was only beginning. The deportation. A slow descent into Siberia. The family were taken to a railway siding on the outskirts of town, not to a passenger platform, but to a row of dark cattle cars sitting like giant waiting coffins. When the doors slid open, the smell of damp wood and stale straw drifted out. Prisoners were packed inside with brutal efficiency. Former officials, frightened villagers, people condemned not by what they had done, but by the names they carried. Johann and his family were pushed into the cramped darkness, and before they could find their footing, the doors slammed shut. Inside, time slowed into something almost unbearable. Light seeped through the thin cracks between the boards, just enough to reveal tired faces and shivering bodies. A single bucket in the corner served as a toilet. Food came once a day if they were lucky, a ladle of watery soup and a crust of hard black bread that tasted more like grit than nourishment. The cold seeped through the wooden walls and into their bones, a constant biting presence that made sleep feel dangerous. Days passed without anyone knowing how many, then weeks. The train crawled farther east, rocking slowly as though determined to prolong the suffering of everyone inside. Outside the cracks, the familiar hills of Austria disappeared, replaced by endless plains that stretched beyond sight. The air grew sharper, colder, thinner. This was not just winter, it was Russia, and then it was Siberia. People began to fail. Some collapsed from hunger. Some were overcome by fever. Others remained conscious but silent, hollowed out by fear. Johann, young and terrified, tried to stay close to his parents, though they too were weakening. The journey felt like a cruel test, one that seemed designed not to transport prisoners, but to kill them long before reaching their destination. When the train finally screeched to a stop, the doors opened with a shock of blinding light and freezing air. The prisoners squinted as they stepped down into a world of white. Snow covered everything. Trees, roofs, even the barbed wire that stretched around the perimeter of the camp. Watchtowers stood at every corner, and the wind sliced across the open ground with a force that seemed capable of cutting through skin. This was their new home, a Soviet labor camp deep in the Siberian wilderness. Daily life there was defined by one rule: work until you cannot stand, then keep working. Prisoners were sent into the frozen forest to fell trees with numb hands. They hauled logs heavier than their exhausted bodies could bear. Their clothing was thin, their boots cracked open from the cold, and hunger was a constant companion that never loosened its grip. At night, they huddled inside wooden barracks that trapped the cold instead of keeping it out. In this place, names no longer mattered. Backgrounds, histories, innocence, none of it made a difference. The system saw only numbers, bodies to be pushed until they broke. And in the eyes of the guards, Johann's crime was already decided long before he stepped foot in the camp. He carried the blood of Adolf Hitler. That alone sealed his fate. For Johann, the warm fields of Austria must have felt like a memory from another life, fading more each day. The faces of his parents and cousin grew hollow. The wind never stopped, and every morning when the guards shouted for the prisoners to rise, fewer men stood up than the day before. He had been taken not for anything he had done, but for the shadow his cousin cast across the world. Somewhere along the endless tracks into Siberia, Johann understood a terrifying truth. If he ever lived long enough to speak again, the world would need to hear what he had witnessed. Johann's confession. In the 1990s, shortly before the NKVD files became public, an aging Austrian priest stepped forward with a secret he had carried for decades. Johann's secret. He revealed that he had been a young chaplain assigned to the Siberian camp hospital during the final months of the war. And one evening, as Johann lay weak and fevered, he asked for confession. His voice was barely a whisper, but his words were clear. "Before I die, I need to tell someone the truth." The priest leaned close. Johann continued, "People will say Hitler became a monster because the world failed him, but that is not true. I saw the monster before the world did." There was a story Johann never forgot, something his father told him when he was young. Back in 1907, Adolf Hitler, still just a teenage boy, came to visit the family. They were sitting in the garden when Adolf suddenly picked up a frog. Without any emotion, he began talking about its anatomy. Then he said, almost casually, "If I hit a nerve here, it dies." And right in front of everyone, he cut the frog open, calm, steady, almost proud of what he was doing. Johann's father watched in silence. Years later, he still remembered the moment, not because of the act itself, but because of how normal Adolf acted while doing it, like it was nothing, like it was a trick he enjoyed showing off, not clumsily, like children sometimes do out of morbid curiosity, not nervously or with a wince, but with a strange, calm precision. Johann's father later described the look on Adolf's face. He wasn't curious, he wasn't excited, he felt nothing. He looked at the frog the way a butcher looks at meat. When Johann's father asked why he did it, Adolf simply replied, "You learn a lot when you open things up." Then he wiped the knife on his trouser leg and walked away, leaving the frog split open on the stump as if it meant nothing at all. Years later, when Hitler's name echoed across Europe and the world tried to explain his cruelty, Johann wrote only one private comment about the story his father told him. "People believed power corrupted him, but I saw it long before he had power. Cruelty was already living inside him." It was the kind of memory Johann kept buried for decades. He would only reveal once in his life, just before he died. He further told the priest, cruelty was not taught to him. It lived inside him, and it followed all of us in every branch of the family until it killed us too. With his last strength, Johann said, "Please, do not let the world forget that we were innocent, and that he was not born like other men." For 70 years, the world never knew what Johann whispered before he died. Now the silence finally breaks, and nothing about Hitler's past will ever look the same. History remembers the monsters, but rarely the ordinary people trapped in their shadow. Johann Schmidt Jr. never chose his connection to Adolf Hitler. He held no power, committed no crime, yet he paid with his freedom and his life. He died far from home, lost beneath Siberia's frozen silence, punished for a name he never asked for. But now, after decades of silence, his story finally returns. It reminds us of something we often forget. Evil destroys more than its enemies. It destroys everyone near it. If you found this story worth hearing, make sure to like, share, and subscribe.